Hey everyone, it's Tony D again with another video about screenwriting. Today's screenwriting tips are about the first act. Now, we already did the video about getting started. So the first act is actually a little further down the process, because the first thing you need to do is get your premise. And we talked about that in getting started. Once you have your premise, once you have your opener, then the first act is where you lay the foundation for the other two acts. All right? Now, you have to keep it fairly loose and just sort of write it. Okay? Don't think about it too much, because later you're gonna, when you rewrite it, you're gonna have to go back and retrofit a few things that make more sense with the ending. Right? Because anything you put in the beginning of the screenplay should be important in the second and third acts too. It should hold some weight. Not everything, but a lot of things, the important things. So you may not realize exactly what's important when you start writing the screenplay, you know, until you get to that final act and those final important emotional moments for your character. You kind of got to keep it loose, because you're not sure where, you may not be 100% sure. You may know the ending. You may know the ending of the plot, but you may discover that there is more weight emotionally in one of the other characters or one of the other incidents. So keep it loose, but get the damn thing done, and understand what you need as a foundation. You need to establish the world, okay, and the rules in that world. If you are in a world that's normal, present day, modern world, then you want to establish it. There should be routine stuff going on, nothing crazy. There shouldn't be animated characters running around. There shouldn't be robots and androids and vampires or anything like that. It should be very normal if that's what you're establishing. If you do, you know, if you're doing a comedy and you do one crazy bit in the beginning, that could confuse the audience, because then they could say, oh, well, I guess I'm in some sort of crazy world here where anything can happen. You don't want to do that out the gate in a comedy. You may eventually get there, like in the movie, I always like to talk about Animal House, that one bit in the movie where Kevin Bacon gets flattened by the crowd in the third act. And he's actually flat, like on the sidewalk. That's, you know, breaking the physics of that world. It's very realistic. Most of Animal House is. Nothing super crazy happens in Animal House in terms of, you know, defying the laws of gravity or physics or anything like that, until that moment. That moment is like, what? But, you know, it's the end, it's chaos, and you can get away with it then. So if you look at a movie, well, it's kind of a movie, not really. The Black Mirror opening episode, Bandersnatch, right? We could look at that first act. Now, if you haven't seen it, spoiler alert. And it doesn't totally, the rules don't totally apply to Bandersnatch in particular, because of this choose your own adventure format they went with. But basically, what do they establish in the first act? Well, they establish a protagonist who's a little shaky. He's got to take drugs. You know, there was some early trauma in his life. He has kind of a rough relationship with his dad, who he lives with. His dad is always locking the door of his bedroom, which is a little suspicious, because they live together and obviously have lived together. And it's 1984, and he works or wants to work for a computer company. In the early days of video games, right? So all that stuff is contributing to what's going to happen down the road. And when you lay out that foundation, you need to have a payoff. So if he's taking drugs, and you have shots of him taking drugs, then the drugs have to be important in some way. And they were in Bandersnatch. It was important because part of the movie is questioning whether or not he was insane, or were the choices happening? Could he perceive those choices that you're making in Netflix? Was he going crazy? You know, that was all relevant to the story. So, showing the drugs, yes. The ashtray that he hits his father with, not quite as relevant, even though it's shown, but because you show it, you know, because early in the movie, the father puts his cigarettes out in this big ashtray, later when the son hits him with it, it's sort of representative of his, I don't know, I guess his relationship with his dad in a way, because the ashtray in some respects represents his dad and how annoying he is to him, and so he hits him with the ashtray. And that makes sense because it's 1984. It's a time when a lot of people still smoked. Ashtrays, in case you don't know it, could be very heavy, and you could kill somebody with it. It was usually a plot from a 70s TV show when somebody got killed, like one of the murder's weapons could be an ashtray, not like today where you hardly ever see an ashtray. So if he had picked up, I don't know, a knife that they had never alluded to in the first act, that wouldn't have been as effective. It was more effective that the ashtray was shown early, and then that the ashtray was then used as the murder weapon in one of those choice scenes. Okay, so again, anything you mention early should have some sort of payoff. So after you get the world established, you need to establish your protagonists and the other characters around them and who is going to be important to the movie as it unfolds. In Bandersnatch, the father is a key figure to the main character. So is his therapist or psychiatrist. So are the characters from the computer company, the gaming company. They're key too. I mean, you know, people who aren't key in Bandersnatch is the woman riding the bus behind him. She doesn't have any dialogue. She's just background noise. So, you know, if that woman had a line in the first act when he was on the bus and you choose the music, then you would have to somehow bring that woman back in a later scene. If you were writing Bandersnatch and you got to the end of the story and you realized, I have this line of this woman on the bus, just sort of this throwaway line like, oh, go sit over there or something, then you might say to yourself, well, there's no later scene with the bus lady, might as well just cut that line out, let her be a background character. It's all about driving the story to the end and doing what you want for the story, not, you know, gumming up the works with a bunch of extraneous nonsense. You know, Bandersnatch in a lot of ways is a dark story because it's Black Mirror. One of the important elements is that the author of Bandersnatch, the book in this story, who went crazy and killed his wife, he's mentioned very early on. He's a very key component of that story. He went crazy, killed his wife. You are also seeing the main character maybe go crazy and maybe kill his dad. So these parallels are important for that particular story. Having the character read something else, you know, is not relevant. It wouldn't be relevant for him to read in the opening scene, in the first act we're talking about, like a Newsweek magazine. Maybe you could say, well, I want him to read a Newsweek to establish that it's 1984, but there are other ways to do that. And they did that with the music. It was pretty clear. And they did that with the key in the opening of the movie. I think it starts July something, 1984. So that would be superfluous. You wouldn't need it. So since the time is established, you know, you want to get right into it. You want him to be reading the most important thing in the movie, in the story, which is Bandersnatch, which is, you know, the whole piece centers around the book and the genius of the author of that book. Another movie which I'm a huge fan of, which my movie friends always make fun of me for, but I still stand by it. One of my favorite movies, Predator 2. Not Predator 1, which I do like, but Predator 2 to me is such an awesome movie. I loved it because it's a non-stop action roller coaster ride, except for maybe one scene. And I just like it because I love the protagonist, Danny Glover, as the out-of-breath cop just chasing the Predator relentlessly. I love it. So what do we establish in that movie in the first act? Well, we established that, again, spoilers, we established that the various elements of the Predator, they're attracted to violence and heat, and when they show up, they're showing up to hunt. They show up and they kill a bunch of drug dealers that the LAPD, I think it's the LAPD, right? Yeah, I think it is. They're fighting a drug cartel, and the Predators wipe them all out. And that's the way the Predators are, right? So they not only wipe them out and kill them, but they also take trophies and leave bodies hanging from the ceiling and, headless corpses all over the place, and leave the cops behind to go, what the heck happened? And that's how the movie basically opens. It's a great way to open a movie because there's lots of action. You get the sci-fi elements. You don't have to do too much explaining the Predators because they've already been established in the previous movies. Plus, you got Danny Glover, who, he's already coming off the Lethal Weapon movies, so he's already played a cop. He's basically playing another version of Murtaugh in that movie, which is part of the great thing about it. And the other great thing about it, he is totally outmatched by the Predator. He's hunting the Predator, and the Predator has a million weapons and all kinds of ways to kill him, but Danny just has his gun, and he's just running after him, jumping across buildings and doing all these stunts, and he's out of breath and he's hurting himself. It's just so great. I love it. So that to me is a great setup for the movie. It lags a little bit in the center. Some of the other characters, it's not just all Danny, but he's the most relentless one, and the other characters are also sort of in it, and they're hunting the Predator too. But really, it's Danny Glover who's sort of in charge of the whole thing. That all leads to the final battle, which to me is, again, I just love it. I love that Danny Glover's character, despite all the odds, one of the big scenes in that movie is from the first movie. We know that when the Predator gets killed or is dying, they push this thing on their wristband, and they self-destruct, right? So there's that scene in the first movie when Arnold Schwarzenegger, he finally kills the Predator or mortally wounds him, and the Predator pushes a bunch of buttons and starts laughing, and you see the readout on his wrist, but you don't know what it says. But the way the sounds are coming off the computer wrist thingy, it sounds like a countdown. So Schwarzenegger just sort of gets the message and runs, and then there's a big explosion. The great thing about Predator 2 is they up the ante, and Danny cuts off his arm before he can arm it, and so the Predator can't kill himself, and Danny along with him, which is, I think, part of the milieu of the Predator series. And then Danny in the final scene gets into the ship and fights the one-armed Predator with his own weapon and beats him. And that's to me, it's just a mind-blowing scene. And then all the Predators show up, and they're so impressed by Danny winning the fight, they throw him a trophy and then let him live. Because that's the way the Predators are. They're like this honorable guys. But all that setup comes from, the beginning. It's the beginning is hunting. Danny's a hunter. He's a hunter of criminals. The Predator's a hunter of men, or other predators, and they revel in the hunt. And to some extent, Danny's character revels in the hunt. I forget the character's name in the movie, but you know, it's not like a metaphor, but it's a parallel thing. It's the, you know, hunters hunting prey and cops hunting criminals. So that's what it's established. Now, if you were writing that movie, you might do a first draft of that movie, and maybe, you know, you get to the end of it, and instead of picking the Danny Glover character to fight the Predator at the end, you end up picking one of the more, you know, younger, more virile cop characters fights the Predator at the end. And what you might look at that screenplay, you know, going back to do the rewrite, and say to yourself, well, wait a minute. Do I really want, is that the guy with the character art here? You know, it's a bit of an ensemble cast because there's like 4 or 5 characters in the beginning who are the cops looking for the Predator, but, you know, you may say to yourself, it makes more sense that the younger, stronger cop can beat the Predator, but it's not as interesting, right? So you might say, no, the Danny Glover character is the character with the chip on his shoulder who has to win to just prove himself, you know, still capable of hunting down a murderer, even though the murderer is from another planet. You know, the stronger guy beating him, it's not as cool. And besides, we saw that in the first Predator movie. And it's also a very close fight. It's very gritty. It's not like Danny Glover wins handily. He barely wins. He is lucky to win the fight. You know, there's a couple of scenes where he's almost killed by the Predator's weapons, and for various reasons. I think there's a scene where the Predator shoots some of his disc out of his thing, and because there are speakers in the room with magnets in it, it throws off his shot, and the seeking disc, or whatever you call him, instead of cutting Danny or one of the other cops, they end up in the speaker. So it's just something that, you know, there are interesting ways to sort of give characters a break. You know, even though in a fair fight, the Danny Glover character would have lost against the Predator, but because the Danny Glover character is in his home turf, and because maybe the Predator has bitten off a little more than he could chew, and because the Predators want this great challenge, you can make it believable that a character like it, at least it was believable to me. To a lot of my friends, they go, oh, that movie's just a regular movie. No, I really like that movie. So your first act establishes all that. And when you're writing a screenplay, you're writing it for the maximum effect. So yes, you have to justify as best you can what you put in the first act, in the second and third acts, but you can also go back and create something that you want to justify. So in other words, if there was a payoff that you discover while writing your third act that would really make sense emotionally and along with your whole theme that you can add, then you add it, and then go back and put in in the first act and the second act, you put in the foreshadowing or the establishment of those things. So when you get to that third act, that does pay off. It sounds like a backwards way of doing it, but that's why the first draft of a screenplay is so important. Because once you get to that, once you have the whole screenplay, then you could start looking at it and say, well, here's all the elements in the first act. Do they repeat and intensify in acts 2 and 3? Because they should. If they don't, then maybe you don't need them. Maybe it's superfluous. So again, going back to Bandersnatch, if you need to kill the dad, you want to use something that's been established in the first act. And what was established that could kill him? The ashtray. That was established. Now, again, maybe they didn't put the ashtray in the first draft and they went back and added it. Another thing is in Bandersnatch we have this part of the choices or the scenes in the movie is we have this idea that the choices that they want to make in the game also can apply to reality. So then we have this reality bending scene where they take drugs and one of the characters, you know, makes a choice to do something very extreme, which forget it, I already said spoilers. So he jumps off the balcony. You have to choose which one jumps off the balcony, which is a very 1980s concept, by the way. You know, when there were all the anti-drug stuff came out, like one of the big fears was you were going to take drugs and jump out a balcony because you were so high. So that's something that gets set up by the mere fact that you're playing this weird or watching this weird TV show interactive thing where you make choices for the character. Bandersnatch is about choices and how those choices impact the characters and whether or not, you know, you can change the past. So you're establishing that in that first act, and you're establishing that the computer guy is it's almost like an avatar into that world, right? Because that's one of the choices down the road. You know, he's the one who tells him all these crazy things about Pac-Man, why it's called Pac, program and control. So the idea that we're all controlled somehow, and then that turns out to be one of the third act revelations that, oh yeah, your father's not your father, he's a guy who's just been studying you your entire life, which is, you know, crazy mind-blowing concept. But is it reality? We don't know, because he's also off his meds. So what is reality? At the end of Bandersnatch, we kind of don't know. It's sort of up in the air, and that's the fun thing about that. But it all gets laid out, and it's very important in Bandersnatch to lay out that world, because without that established world, you can't play those weird games of, well, what if the main character figures out he's being toyed with, and we could talk to him from our 2018 perspective and tell him he's stuck in Netflix and we're making the choices for him. That is, you know, one of the things we get to see play out, and it's a thing that gets established in that the groundwork for that is in the first act, because we keep going back to scenes and seeing how they could unfold differently, and without those basic things established, people get lost. You know, you can't just keep introducing new characters. I mean, the reality is, real life is not like movie life or TV life. TV life has a limited number of characters and locations. Some of that's pragmatic for shooting purposes, but other times it's about keeping the audience focused on these particular characters to get your message across. You don't want like dozens and dozens of characters. You don't want to keep bombarding the audience with characters, because just like anything else, they become numb to it. Too much action, too much comedy, too many characters all at once. It's hard. It's hard to keep that in a balance. Think about the TV shows you watch and like. Think about how many characters. Do you find yourself sitting there going, man, I wish there were 50 more characters on screen? No. You don't want that. You don't want random people from life just showing up and then disappearing and never being seen again. Now, granted, that happens on occasion, but you don't want that for every character. You know, unless you're trying to do a thing about that, but that's a little different. That's a little more specific. But in general, you know, for Bandersnatch, you needed that focus on these limited characters because you're going to see them again and again in different situations. For your screenplay, it will largely depend upon the genre, but in general, most screenplays are going to have a limited number of characters, a limited amount of locations, and you're going to see them again and again. You know, an exception to the rule, and I always talk about these movies, James Bond. In James Bond, the locations are like anywhere because James Bond goes all over the world. So in some respects, the locations aren't as important. It's like every location is a new revelation for Bond. But not true with the characters, right? We have a villain, and we're going to see him again and again and again. We establish him in the first act. He goes back and forth with Bond, kind of beats him in the second act, and then in the third act, Bond wins. Same thing with the girl. You might see her in the first act, Bond seduces her, but gets betrayed by her or tricked by her, but in the third act, she comes around and they beat the villain together and then they're in the submarine or whatever. So, in your first act, write it, and after you're finished, move on to the second act and start heightening the things that you mentioned in the first act. And by things, I don't mean actual objects, I mean events, emotions, sometimes include the other objects. Whenever you can, you know, if a scene has to take place in a house and you've established a house, if there's a reason, no other reason to move them, you could keep it in the same house. Why not? If there's no reason to move the location, why move it? You know, unless the world feels small by keeping it there, you probably want it in the same house. You establish things in the first act, so by the third act we can go, wow, you planned that all along. You may not have when you in the first draft. You may have to go back and really think about what you added. But don't get wrapped around the axle about trying to write your first act. Just write the damn thing. You know, follow logic. If you're establishing a world of your own logic, it gets a little more complicated if it's in the future and, you know, there's sci-fi elements or if there's supernatural elements. But even those elements need rules that you know. Now, maybe the audience doesn't know them immediately, but you have to set up a consistent set of rules. So in your world, if you have vampires, you have to plot out in your brain what your vampires do in that world. Are they real vampires? Do they disintegrate in the sunlight? Are they some sort of biological vampire? Are they some sort of alien vampire? Are they some sort of metaphorical vampire, emotional vampire? Do they follow a particular culture of vampires? Because there's all kinds of different cultural vampires from around the world. Or do they follow sort of the classic vampire? Or is somebody insane and they only think there are vampires? Is it a bunch of goth kids acting like vampires? You have to establish that from the outset, whether you reveal that to your audience right away or not. You may not reveal it in the first act. It may be, you know, a big twist that you're going to have at the end. But you need to know that when you're writing. If you don't, that's okay too. You may get to the end and you may discover the ending. You may discover like, hey, I wanted this to be a movie about fake vampires, but no, at the end there's a real vampire. That could be your statement. You know, or the reverse. You could have a world where there's vampires everywhere, but at the end you reveal like, no, you've been watching a crazy person and all his vampire delusions the entire time. You know, either way you can make it work. But whatever happens in that first act, heighten it and see where it goes. Okay, that's enough about the first act. Just remember that when you build a screenplay, it's like building a house, and your house foundation is Act 1. My name is Tony D. That's it for Screenwriting Tips today. I would just like to give a personal shout out to the late, great Super Dave Osborne, who passed away, otherwise known as Albert Brooks's brother, who their last name really was Einstein. Super Dave Osborne was one of my favorites. I did a comic strip as an homage to him on the Superfrat site. You can check out my comics at Superfrat or the Webcomic Factory. I was just a big fan of Super Dave, and if you haven't watched Super Dave Osborne's awesome stunts, please do yourself a favor, Google them, and enjoy. That's it for Screenwriting Tips. I'm Tony D. See you next time.